Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Rebuttal Podcast, where we break down case law, calamity, and of course, chaos in the legal field. I am once again your host, Reb Maisel, and today's intro is really not going to be an intro at all. We are getting right into it. Let's go. At 11:45 a.m. on May 25th, 1935, an 8-year-old George Weyerhaeuser left Tacoma's Lowell Grammar School to walk home. And in just a few minutes, he was kidnapped, snatched by 3 people who wanted a ransom from his extremely wealthy family. You see, George was one of the heirs to the Weyerhaeuser timber dynasty. This dynasty started around 1900 when a German-American immigrant, Frederick Weyerhaeuser, started buying up some land, some forest land, and started this timber mill company. One of the most famous prisoners at Alcatraz was a man by the name of Harmon Waley. He served one of the longest consecutive terms on Alcatraz Island, which was 22 years. 7 of those years he spent in solitary confinement. Harmon Waley was famous because he was sentenced to 45 years in prison for the kidnapping of 8-year-old George Weyerhaeuser, the little heir to the massive Weyerhaeuser Company dynasty, a huge timber company which operated in the Pacific Northwest and had been founded by a German-American immigrant in 1900. That German-American immigrant, Frederick Weyerhaeuser, was George's great-grandfather, who is still to this day on the top 12 list of richest men alive, alongside Bill Gates. George Weyerhaeuser, on May 24th, 1935, was walking home from school because he had been released early and his chauffeur had not shown up yet. While he was walking, a car pulled up beside him, a man got out, and it didn't even occur to George to start running. He was held for 8 days with 3 kidnappers, one of whom was Harmon. During that time, he was shackled, blindfolded, thrown in the trunk of a car. He was led through the forest with the blindfold on, then shackled at the bottom of a pit about 4 feet wide and 4 feet deep. He was taken to a shack in the middle of the forest and then eventually transferred from Tacoma, Washington to Idaho. And throughout that entire time, of course, terrified, scared, and freezing cold. Finally, the ransom exchange was made and he was safely returned to his family. The kidnappers would be caught and sentenced and sent to prison. But what George Weyerhaeuser remembers is that the only kidnapper who was nice to him was Harmon Waley, the man who was sent to Alcatraz prison. During the 28 years that Harmon Waley would spend in prison, he would write to George Weyerhaeuser. During the time he was at Alcatraz, he told George that he was sorry about his role in the kidnapping and that he hoped George was doing well. Not only did George Weyerhaeuser reply in letters to Harmon Waley, he would write a letter on Harmon Waley's behalf when Harmon was up for parole, stating that Harmon should indeed be released. When Harmon was finally released, he was 52 years old. George was 37. At that time, George had become CEO of the Weyerhaeuser Company based out of Tacoma, Washington. Harmon, upon his release, had trouble getting a job. He wanted to just start his life over and make money himself. He ran out of options very quickly. No one wanted to hire the infamous Harmon Waley, one of the Alcatraz prisoners. So he said, fine, I will try one last time to ask something of George Weyerhaeuser beyond just his forgiveness. And that was a letter asking him for a job. George Weyerhaeuser replied, hey, sure thing, I'll give you one. George Weyerhaeuser, indeed, hired his kidnapper to work for the Weyerhaeuser Company 28 years after Harmon Waley kidnapped George. Harmon would not only take the job and be a very good, diligent worker working in the lumber yards, but he would have that job until his death several years later. When asked about why in the world he would hire his kidnapper, for a job at the very company which made him his fortune and which made him the target of said kidnapping and ransom scheme. Weyerhaeuser said that he never forgot that Harmon was the only one who was nice to him. Quote, "It's hard to describe the relationship with somebody who you've spent some time with and had a rather unique experience with. The fact that I came out alive has something to do with the way Harmon handled me." This is going to be the story of the Weyerhaeuser kidnapping and, of course, Harmon Waley and his bizarre but kind of heartwarming later relationship with the little boy that he kidnapped. Let's do it, guys. The Weyerhaeuser Company is still one of the largest producers of lumber, pulp, paper, packaging materials, and other wood-related products. It operates about 270 sawmills, pulp and paper mills, and wood product plants in 18 different countries. The company also is among the world's largest private landowners, controlling 7 million acres of forest in the U.S. and another 31 million acres in Canada. A pioneer in the practice of, quote, high-yield forestry in the 1960s, Weyerhaeuser has more recently become an industry leader in sustainable forest management. The Weyerhaeuser family, of course, is loaded. They are rich. They have been rich for quite a long time. There is a Weyerhaeuser fortune that absolutely the members of the Weyerhaeuser family have to protect and, of course, are passing down through the generations. By the time 1935 rolled around, the family was absolutely a target for kidnapping or ransom schemes. At least they definitely thought they would be. The Lindbergh kidnapping had stirred troubles and anxieties in the U.S. about when this could possibly happen again. And the Weyerhaeuser family was, of course, on the short list of families that could be targets for such a ransom demand. Sure enough, on May 24th, 1935, the worst indeed happened. On May 24th, 1935, George Weyerhaeuser was 9 years old, attending the Lowell Elementary School in Tacoma, Washington. It released its students early that day, and so George walked, as usual, from his school to the Annie Wright Seminary to meet his sister. The two were typically picked up by the family chauffeur from there and taken home for lunch. But it was 11:45. George had been let out early. And so when he arrived at the seminary early, he decided to just walk home instead. This wasn't strange to do in this very wealthy community in Tacoma, Washington. It was safe. Nothing really happened. But today was going to be different. George took the overgrown path that ran along the edge of the Tacoma Lawn Tennis Club grounds. When George emerged onto Borough Road, just a few streets over from his house, a green 1927 Buick was waiting with two men inside. The passenger got out of the sedan and asked George for directions to Stadium Way. It never even occurred to George to run. The man grabbed him, put his hand over his mouth, dragged him to the trunk of the car, dumped him on the floor of the trunk, put an old blanket over him, and told him not to move or make any noise. The car rolled down the hill out of the quiet residential neighborhood. It passed through Tacoma and disappeared into back roads before George was ever noted as missing from his home. When the car stopped and the blanket was removed, he saw two men with hoods over their heads. There were trees all around. He could hear the sound of a river. The men told him to write his name on the back of an envelope, which he did. He was blindfolded again and led into the woods across a running stream. Quote, "I thought they were going to push me into the water," George says. Beside a deep pit in the woods, his blindfold was taken off. The pit was 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, covered with tin, braced with posts, and lined with boards. The boy was lowered into it and fastened, shackled, to a crosspiece by handcuffs, one on an arm and the other on a leg. One man drove away to mail the ransom note by special delivery. Philip Weyerhaeuser, George's father, was directed to say nothing to anyone, to keep the news out of the papers, to gather 5,000 old $20 bills, 5,000 old $10 bills, and 10,000 old $5 bills, which totaled about $200,000. When he had the money ready, he was told he had to place an ad in the personals column of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which read, quote, "We are ready," and sign it, Percy Minnie. In the evening, just before dark, the men returned to the pit and everyone ate a picnic lunch of sandwiches, cookies, and hard-boiled eggs. Then George was again handcuffed and entombed with 2 blankets and a kerosene lantern for warmth. The Weyerhaeuser family had come up against a small-town Bonnie and Clyde partnership that had added a tough third partner. The woman involved was a very pretty but very placid Margaret Waley, who was married to Harmon Waley, the other man involved in the kidnapping. Harmon was tall, handsome, 24 years old, and a Washington native. He had been in and out of jails and reformatories from the time he was 17. In prison, he came to know a man named William Mahan, also known as William Daynard and Swede Davis, who was winding up his term for bank robbery. Mahan had 5 bank holdups under his belt, including a $100,000 bank robbery in Idaho. These 3 were living in Spokane when Margaret happened upon an obituary in the newspaper for a John Philip Weyerhaeuser Sr., George's grandfather. He had died, and the obituary recalled all of the stories about the Weyerhaeuser family's wealth and success. Margaret was the one who had the idea to kidnap George Weyerhaeuser for a ransom because, hey, the family's super rich. Why would they mind, right? And the Lindbergh kidnapping had happened. So, hey, this might be a copycat, but maybe it'll work out for us. 3 days after reading that obituary in the newspaper, Margaret, Waley, and Mahan were following George around Tacoma. They were studying his movements as he went to and from school, and they had actually not intended to pick George up when they did. They didn't know that his elementary school would release them about 15 minutes early. They didn't know that George would end up deciding to walk home and be on Borough Road at the time that they were. It was entirely coincidence. And they said, yeah, this is going to be the time we got to do it. They were merely checking his route when he happened to walk up to the car. The police had already been called when the ransom note arrived at the Weyerhaeuser home, so the instructions not to call them could not really be followed. Philip Weyerhaeuser got the bills together and placed the ad in the paper as he had been ordered to do, but added another line, quote, "Due publicity beyond our control. Please indicate another method of reaching you. Hurry. Percy Minnie." This was because the Weyerhaeusers didn't really give a shit about what the police told them to do. They told the police, hey, we already called you, so you're already involved, but we are absolutely going to negotiate with these kidnappers. We just want our son home, so do not get involved unless it's absolutely necessary. They wanted to indeed follow the exact instructions of what the kidnappers told them to do in their letter, in their note, to place these personal ads in the newspaper and gather the money up. They said, hey, y'all need to take a back seat because I don't want y'all to botch this. And they said, okay, fine. So they were pleading with the kidnappers in the personal ads to not do anything to harm their son simply because the police have been involved. It's not their fault. It's not their fault. Okay. When the kidnappers returned to the pit after delivering the letter to Weyerhaeuser's family, someone in the area had shot at something near them in the forest, and that alarmed them. So they moved George deeper into the woods, into a second pit that they had dug for such emergencies. He was again handcuffed to a post in the pit and left there that night and the next day. George Weyerhaeuser would later give a pretty detailed interview about his experience at 9 years old during this kidnapping, and he actually would laugh about it and say, well, for most of the time I spent sleeping. I was sleeping in the pit. George actually later credited his youth to how well he, recovered from this traumatic incident. He actually said that he didn't think it really affected him that much, which is kind of crazy and maybe a total lie, but who knows. The following night, when Mahan had read Philip Weyerhaeuser's answer in the classified ads, again, Philip is George's dad, George was lifted out of this second pit and locked in the trunk of Mahan's gray Ford coupe. He was driven all night across the state to Spokane, Washington, 300 miles east, a very hard trip, even in the front seat of a car in 1935. I can imagine that shit's bumpy as fuck, okay? Good Lord. Mahan occasionally yanked little George around, but Harmon Waley would often rescue him from Mahan's violent tendencies. And of course, as we know now, George remembered every single time that Harmon would come to his aid. When Harmon would infrequently be left alone with George when Mahan and Waley's wife would be at a gas station or doing something else and Harmon was told to watch little George, George remembers that Harmon was very nice to him. He was nice to him. He spoke gently to him. He would give him extra food, extra water. He was, again, just being a very stand-up guy when it comes to kidnappers, I guess, right? Like the bar is definitely on the floor, but hey, when you're a 9-year-old kid being actively traumatized, that's going to stick out to you. Absolutely. Near the Idaho-Washington boundary, George was chained to a tree all day while his captors went into the city. They returned that night with a big Uneeda cracker carton, packed George into it, and carried him into their apartment. Insane. Like, this is actually such a fucking crazy saga because it feels never ending, and it's actually crazy that they were really traipsing around like a motherfucker. And why is it that they kept chaining this kid to things? Couldn't you just like handcuff him inside the? I mean, I don't know. I am genuinely shocked that George isn't even mildly fucked up beyond all reason from this. Like, if this were me, I feel like I would never have been even mildly okay. George was then locked in a closet. Harmon Waley slept on a mattress outside the door, however, to ensure that Mahan, the evil one of the group, wouldn't try to go inside and to make sure that if George needed anything, he could call for help. Again, Harmon with the good deeds. Mahan raced back to Seattle to resume an outwardly ordinary life at the Fur Apartments and collect the ransom. The procedure for this was honestly a pretty harrowing melodrama. Margaret, Harmon's wife, who's involved in the kidnapping, mailed a letter to George's father instructing him to register at the Ambassador Hotel in Seattle under the name of John Paul Jones and wait there for a telephone call. At the hotel, Philip Weyerhaeuser got the call, directing him to a point on the highway midway between Seattle and Tacoma. There, he found a stake with a cloth tied to it. A note in a can at the base of the stake directed him to a second stake on a dirt road off the highway. He searched through the night for the second stake, but could not find it. At dawn, he returned to the Ambassador. The phone rang. He was directed to go home and send a different emissary. George's uncle, Rod Titcomb, in turn was phoned at the Ambassador the next night and directed to a place near Halfway House, where the Seattle-Tacoma Airport was later built. A note at the base of a stake directed him to a second stake on a road by Angle Lake, a deep, mile-long trout lake in the woods. Here, he finally found the correct stake and the note, which told him to turn on the dome light of his car, place the suitcase containing the $200,000 in cash on the front seat, leave the engine running, and walk down the road. Mahan and Margaret were parked nearby. There was nothing unusual about a couple in a parked car in this area, apparently. Mahan jumped into Titcomb's car, drove it to a shack he had rented on the edge of Seattle, hid the $200,000 there, and ditched the car on a side street. Margaret drove the other car to the Fur Apartments. Mahan picked it up there and was on his way to Spokane, while Titcomb was still walking back to town. Okay, so mind you too, the police didn't follow them, like they weren't there. The Weyerhaeusers had obviously a lot of influence in the Tacoma, Washington area and over the police. And they were like, listen, we don't give a flying fuck what y'all's procedure is because y'all don't really have one. Like we heard about the Lindbergh kidnapping and it didn't turn out very fucking well. So yeah, we're actually going to do exactly what the kidnappers tell us to do. And we don't want y'all to get involved. You guys can take this over and try to find them after we have our son safe and alive. Okay. Which, you know, I don't really have an opinion on that, but I will say that my personal, just, you know, for entertainment purposes opinion, and because of the fact that we know that the kid ended up being okay. I mean, those parents really ate, honestly, like clearly they did the right thing in this scenario, but whatever. I mean, back in those days, 1935, I'm not trusting the fucking police to do shit. Are you kidding? As the days passed, George and Waley came to an understanding of sorts, okay? George and Harmon, right? Who are left together during this whole time when Margaret and Mahan are traipsing around with the ransom money and the notes and the cryptic messages and the posts and all this stuff, okay? Stealing the car and getting the money and da-da-da. George and Harmon are literally just broing out. They're just hanging. They're chilling. And that would ultimately come to guarantee Harmon's ability to get a job 28 years later. Listen, you can't discount the power of human decency, even when you're doing something terrible otherwise. George was let out of the closet by Harmon when he was confident that there was no danger of anyone else coming by, including any of the other two kidnappers who were busy doing their errands. Harmon was still wearing his hood, so George couldn't see his face, but he spent his time with George alone, playing his ukulele, hanging out, and feeding him as much food as he could. The good treatment, however, ended abruptly when Mahan arrived. Mahan packed George back into the cracker box and locked him in the trunk of the car. They then drove the car to Seattle that night. They picked up Margaret at the apartment, and Mahan and Harmon drove to the shack, divided the money, and put Margaret on a train for Salt Lake City, Utah. Sometime between midnight and dawn, they stopped the car, got George out of the trunk, gave him $1 and 2 blankets, and left him beside the road, okay, in the middle of fucking nowhere. They told George that there would be a shack somewhere nearby that he should walk to, but he actually ended up walking to a nearby farmer's house, which I don't know how he ended up finding, but he did. At this point, he had spent a total of 8 days with his kidnappers. 8 fucking days as a 9-year-old little boy. That is crazy to me. And because super smart George, all right, got his shit together, he just picked up his blankets and started walking, okay? It was raining. He was like, this is annoying. I got to get out of here. I'm tired of this shit. You know what I mean? I want to go back to my chauffeur. Thank you. He came upon a shingled house on a lonely knoll. Mrs. John Boniface, the wife of a stump farmer, was preparing breakfast for her husband and 4 children. George went around to the back of the house and knocked on the kitchen door. When asked who he was, he said, "I'm George Weyerhaeuser." "Hey, it's me. I'm back." Now, mind you, when George was left in the middle of the fucking woods, okay, alongside this random road with his $1 bill and his 2 blankets, his captors had told him that his father would come take him home, despite the fact that no one had told the dad, the family, like where George would be. They were just kind of like dropping the kid and being like, bye. So the kid very well could have died. Absolutely. But I mean, luckily he was close enough to civilization, and luckily he was close enough to not believe his captors. Okay. Because Mahan was the one who said, "Hey, don't move. Don't go anywhere. Your dad's going to come get you." And George was like, I'm calling your bluff. So he wandered to that farmhouse, and after announcing his identity, the family took him in, washed him, gave him clean clothes, and drove him back to Tacoma, Washington in their car. Something super interesting, okay, that is reported on is that a sports writer, a local journalist, sports writer, was somehow able to intercept the car that George was being driven home in, okay? Like the farmers were driving, right? They were like, I don't know. They didn't have a phone, so they were just going to like literally just drive him back to Tacoma. He ended up like negotiating his way into the car, and he interviewed 9-year-old George from the backseat for like the exclusive story before his parents even knew he was alive yet. Ew, right? Like what the fuck, ew. George was like, yeah, I'll sing like a canary, but what the fuck, man? And later when he got older, he was like, wasn't that fucking crazy? Like he talked about that. He's like, that was kind of douchey, don't you think? Like what the hell? Crazy town. Now, despite the fact that the kidnappers specifically said, hey, you know, when you give us the $200,000, it has to be in these unmarked bills, okay? Because unmarked bills sound something like something legit, right? Like the 3 kidnappers were like, yeah, that sounds so good. Okay, that sounds lit. Like that sounds like something correct. They can't trace it. Well, an unmarked bill doesn't really exist because all of these bills all have serial numbers on them. You're able to track them and trace them, etc. So the FBI, which was working on the case, did indeed basically keep track of every bill that was used in the $200,000 ransom that was given to the kidnappers. And the way that they were able to find the kidnappers was they released essentially a list of all of these serial numbers of these bills to all of these places that were local, that were around, okay, whether it be banks or gas stations or stores or whatever. And there was some way for these stores to be able to flag it, to be able to be like, oh, that's the bill, like, you know, and they were directed to basically take the payment, but then just let us know who was there and let us know, you know, when it happened, yada, yada. So that is ultimately how they ended up catching all 3 of them. One of the ransom bills was used to purchase a railroad railway ticket from Huntington, Oregon to Salt Lake City, Utah, which was, again, the train ticket for Margaret. So that led the FBI agents to determine that the purchaser was Harmon Waley. After that, many ransom bills appeared in discount stores in Salt Lake City, and that led them obviously to Margaret because she was the one using those bills. Shortly thereafter, as in like the same day, that Margaret was captured, Harmon was arrested at his home, and after making several false statements, he ultimately confessed that he and William Daynard, aka William Mahan, were the ones who had kidnapped the boy with his wife, Margaret. And he added that his wife had no knowledge of the kidnapping until their arrival in Spokane, but that ended up being bullshit because she was literally the one who had the idea in the first place. But whatever. Okay, whatever. Only about $140,000 of the ransom money was ever actually identified and collected. We don't really know where the rest of it went. Some of it was found, about $3,700 of the dollars of the ransom money was found to be burned in the Waley stove. $5,000 extra was kept by Mahan because, of course, he was the one who said, "Oh yeah, I'm going to split it evenly." He didn't split it evenly. He kept an extra $5,000 under a clump of trees. They had buried $90,790, which they eventually recovered a few days later. I mean, this shit was just everywhere, right? And the police eventually recovered most of it. Recovered most of it and basically gave it back to the Weyerhaeusers. So there's that. Physical evidence, confessions, testimony, all of that, all combined to serve to convict all three of these people. Harmon Waley, his wife Margaret, and then William Mahan. There was another third guy who was identified as one of the accomplices. He was given like 10 years in prison. The rest of them got between 30 to 45 years. Harmon was indeed sentenced to 35 years in prison for the kidnapping and 2 years on a charge for conspiring to kidnap. He entered a plea of guilty on June 21st, 1935. So this happened very quickly. He didn't even try to fight it. He didn't go to trial or anything. He started his sentence in Washington and then was eventually transferred to the penitentiary on Alcatraz Island, where he spent the next 22 years, which is crazy town. Crazy town. One of the longest terms ever spent by anyone at Alcatraz. So Waley was captured, pled guilty, 45 years in prison. He was sentenced to. He ended up serving only 28. His wife was eventually arrested. She actually initially pled not guilty, but then she finally, confessed and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mahan was actually trapped, basically caught in Butte. Is it Butte, Montana or Butte? Butte, B-U-T-T-E, Montana. He ended up escaping and was kept on the run for 2 years and was finally caught, tried, and sentenced to 60 years after he was caught robbing banks and shit. Come on now, Mahan's the one that is really the evil guy here, but not saying that Harmon did something correct, but hey, he owned up to it immediately, Goddamn. While Waley was serving part of his sentence at Alcatraz, he obviously had a bad time there. He would often engage in hunger strikes. He was beaten repeatedly by prison guards. He witnessed several murders actually that took place at Alcatraz. One of them being a prison inmate murdered the barber with a pair of shears. He stuck him in the neck. And while he was there, because he just kind of kept acting out, not necessarily in violent ways, but just kind of in him not liking authority ways, he was put in solitary confinement for a whole lot of those years, 7 of those years. And if you ever visit Alcatraz and have the opportunity to go down in the dungeons where those who were kept in solitary confinement were kept, it is genuinely one of the most horrifying things I've ever seen. It is horrific. And I am going to have a whole episode on solitary confinement and how damaging it is to anyone who is in it. But that is not for today. But I will absolutely be mentioning Harmon Waley when I talk about it. In 1949, a case came out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, Waley versus United States. In that case, one of Harmon Waley's attorneys did indeed file a petition for writ, essentially for him to be released because they claimed that the indictment, which ended up being used in his plea agreement, did not actually describe properly the crime for which he was accused of kidnapping. It was basically Waley's attorney's contention that this indictment did not charge any offense because it didn't allege that the victim was unlawfully held at the time of the interstate transportation, which in order to, plead guilty to like federal crimes, federal crimes have to be implicated. And in this case, because they moved this kid across state lines, it makes it federal, okay? One of the arguments that you can use is, the indictments have to be pretty specific. They have to be pretty spot on. And if the indictments are insufficient, you indeed can have some charges thrown out sometimes. But in this case, it did not work. The court rejected that and said, no, the indictment shows that there is no merit to this contention. It did indeed allege that he transported the kid via interstate transportation, and therefore his appeal was rejected. Okay, the judgment for his sentence is affirmed, and his plea is affirmed, and all of that. And so he indeed was supposed to serve 45 years, and throughout that time, he wrote repeated letters to George Weyerhaeuser, who was growing up, ended up going to college. I believe he went to Yale. He was very successful. He took over the Weyerhaeuser dynasty and company and fortune and ended up running it in a way that was very progressive and seminal. He focused a lot on conservation in order to conserve the woods, that they were continuously cutting from. And I'm not saying necessarily it's very controversial in the environmental space because, they never want to call a timber baron someone that is a really, pro-environmental guy. But it's just a fact that he was very... He pushed for a lot of advancements in the industry that really worked out and kept the Weyerhaeuser name basically huge. They were and still are a conglomerate when it comes to timber companies, and again own and control millions of acres of forest in the Pacific Northwest and Canada. If you've been there, you've probably driven through Weyerhaeuser forests that are literally owned by them. In an article written just a few years before George Weyerhaeuser passed away, which he didn't pass away until 2022 at the age of, 95. So he lived a very long life. After the ransom was paid, he grew up, indeed, with a few signs of trauma, but not too much. He graduated from Yale and worked for 5 decades at Weyerhaeuser Company, where he rose to be the CEO. He said, quote, "I don't think the kidnapping bothered me unduly," he said in a Sports Illustrated 1969 interview, adding that a boy is, quote, "a pretty adaptable organism. He can adjust himself to conditions in a way that no adult could." Mr. Weyerhaeuser oversaw a long period of rapid growth and diversification as CEO, which he started as CEO from 1966 to 1991. Sales in his final year as CEO were more than 10 times the level of his first year, and he remained chairman of the Weyerhaeuser Company until 1999. He would eventually marry his wife, Wendy Weyerhaeuser, and have 5 children, 15 grandchildren, and 17 great-grandchildren, which is very indicative of someone who is running a conglomerate in a dynasty, right? They always have a shit ton of kids. Harmon Waley was finally released on June 3rd, 1963, at 52 years old after spending 28 years in prison, 22 of those at Alcatraz. And he was jobless, and in searching for a job, reached out to George. And George indeed offered Harmon Waley a job at one of his Oregon plants. He ended up being a truck driver and kept that job until he died in 1984 at the age of 73. And by all accounts, other than the kidnapping and the shit that happened before then, when he was getting arrested for petty crimes, he lived a pretty exemplary, boring life after his time in prison and during the time he was employed with the Weyerhaeuser Company, despite being the infamous Weyerhaeuser Kidnapper. George Weyerhaeuser, of course, as I stated, lived to be 95, and he was renowned by some, not everyone, but by some, for his business acumen and his philanthropy. It's obviously not every day you hear of a happy ending to a sordid child kidnapping, much less one where the kidnappee hires his own kidnapper. When asked about it repeatedly over the years, George was pretty tight-lipped about his reasoning for hiring Harmon Waley. In interviews, would be asked about, his relationship with Harmon and asked why he did all of these things. And George kept it pretty tight-lipped for the most part. But what he did say was that, look, me and Harmon aren't friends. We're not good friends by any means. I don't see him ever. But George said that all I ever remember of Harmon Waley is that he was nice to me. and the other ones weren't. And he did his time. So who am I to keep punishing him, especially when I'm the only person who would give him a job? And that is the story, the tale of the Weyerhaeuser Kidnapping, which happened in 1935, and the subsequent hiring of a Harmon Waley, the man who kidnapped. My rebuttal for today's episode is maybe you should be nice to the strangers on the street. Maybe you should be nice to especially the children who you don't even realize are making core memories out of their interactions with you. And if you are going to kidnap anyone, if you're going to rob anyone, if you decide to commit a crime against anyone, being a polite, nice person can really go a long way and can even get you employed years and years and years later. Thanks, guys. Hope you enjoyed this one. I did for sure. Love you. Be safe. See you next time.